He never talked much during rides, just drove in comfortable silence. But when they passed the military section of the airport, the old cab driver slowed down, his eyes scanning the jets with the intensity of someone who knew exactly what he was looking at. The young pilot noticed how the man's hands unconsciously moved to flight positions on the steering wheel, and how his breathing changed when an F-16 roared overhead. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this incredible tale of forgotten courage and silent sacrifice, tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this video today? And if you believe that true heroes don't always wear uniforms, hit that subscribe button, and help us honor those who served in silence. The yellow cab had seen better days. Paint chipped along the edges, vinyl seats cracked from years of use, and the radio that never quite tuned in clearly. But it ran smooth, and that's all Frank Martinez needed. He'd been driving the same routes through the city for 32 years, picking up passengers who climbed in, stated their destination, and spent the ride staring at their phones. Frank preferred it that way. Less talking meant fewer questions, and fewer questions meant fewer memories dragged up from places he'd rather leave buried. He wore the same thing every day: faded jeans, a worn brown leather jacket that had been with him since 1955, and a baseball cap pulled low enough to shade his eyes. His hands, weathered and steady, gripped the steering wheel with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory older than most of his passengers. At 78, Frank had perfected the art of being invisible. He wasn't the chatty driver who shared life stories or offered unsolicited advice. He was just the quiet old man who got you where you needed to go. On time, every time. Most passengers tipped him $1 and forgot about him before they reached their front door. But every Tuesday and Thursday, Frank had a regular. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, 26 years old, fresh out of flight school, stationed at the nearby airbase. Jake was different from the others. He always sat in the front seat, always said "Good morning, sir," and always seemed genuinely interested in the city passing by outside the windows. This particular Thursday morning started like any other. Jake climbed into the front seat at exactly 630 hours, coffee in hand, flight bag slung over his shoulder. "Morning, Frank Bass, please." Frank nodded, pulled away from the curb, and began the familiar 20-minute drive through downtown toward the military airfield. The route was simple enough: Main Street to Highway 9, then a straight shot past the commercial airport before turning onto the restricted access road that led to the base. Frank had driven it so many times he could do it with his eyes closed. But today, something was different. As they approached the civilian airport, Jake noticed Frank's grip tighten on the steering wheel. The old man's eyes, usually focused straight ahead, began scanning the skyline with an intensity Jake had never seen before. When they passed the fence line where military aircraft were parked, Frank unconsciously slowed the cab to 20 miles per hour. Jake watched, fascinated, as Frank's eyes moved from jet to jet with the precision of someone conducting an inspection. His breathing had changed too, becoming deeper, more controlled. And then Jake saw something that made him sit up straighter. Frank's left hand had moved from the wheel to his thigh, his fingers positioned exactly as they would be on a flight stick. "You know those birds, Frank?" Jake asked casually, testing the waters. Frank's eyes snapped back to the road. "What's that? The jets? You were looking at them like you knew them?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working silently. "I know what planes look like, son. Been driving past this place for 30 years. But Jake wasn't convinced. The way Frank had assessed those aircraft wasn't casual observation. It was professional evaluation. The kind of look Jake recognized from his own instructors. Men who could tell you everything about a plane's capabilities just by watching it taxi. As they continued toward the base, an F-16 thundered overhead, banking left after takeoff. Frank's reaction was immediate and involuntary. His right hand moved to where a throttle would be. His eyes tracked the aircraft's ascent with perfect precision. And Jake could have sworn he heard the old man whisper something that sounded like "Gear up, flaps clean." "Frank," Jake said carefully, "were you ever in the service?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Frank's knuckles were white on the steering wheel now, and when he finally spoke, his voice was different, quieter, but somehow heavier. "Long time ago, son. Different war, different world." Jake wanted to push, but something in Frank's tone told him to wait. They were approaching the base gate now, and Frank began the familiar routine of stopping at the checkpoint, showing his commercial driver's license, and waiting for the security guard to wave them through. But today, Sergeant Miller, the gate guard, did something unusual. Instead of his typical cursory glance, he leaned down to Frank's window and really looked at him. Miller was a veteran himself, 20 years in the Marines, and he had the kind of eyes that recognized things others missed. "Sir," Miller said slowly, "I don't mean to be forward, but is that a Silver Star ribbon on your jacket?" Jake's head snapped around. He'd been riding with Frank twice a week for 6 months, and had never noticed the small, faded ribbon pinned to the inside of the old man's jacket. It was barely visible, worn thin by time and weather, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Frank's jaw tightened. "Like I said, different war." Miller straightened up and snapped a sharp salute. "Thank you for your service, sir." Frank nodded once, just once, and drove through the gate. But Jake could see the tension in his shoulders. The way his breathing had become carefully controlled. Whatever Frank was carrying, it was heavy. They drove in silence to the flight line, where Jake usually got out. But today, instead of immediately climbing out, Jake turned to study the man who had driven him dozens of times, without ever really being seen. "What did you fly, Frank?" The question was so quiet, Frank almost didn't hear it. When he did, his entire body went still. For a moment Jake thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, almost imperceptibly, Frank's eyes drifted to the F-16S parked on the tarmac. F-86 Sabre, he said finally. "Korea, 1952 to 1953. Jake's eyes widened. The F-86 was legendary, the aircraft that had dominated the skies over Korea, flown by pilots who had become legends themselves. But more than that, Jake knew enough military history to understand what Frank was really telling him. "You were there, during the worst of it," Jake said, not really a question. Frank's hands were shaking now, just slightly. "MiG Alley. We called it the meat grinder." He paused, his eyes distant. "Lost a lot of good men up there." Jake wanted to ask more, but Frank was already pulling away from the curb. "I'll pick you up at 1800 hours, like always." That evening, Jake couldn't concentrate on his training exercises. All he could think about was the quiet old man who had been driving him around the city, the man who had survived one of the most dangerous air campaigns in American history and never mentioned it once. When Frank picked him up that evening, Jake had done his homework. "Frank, I looked up the F-86 squadrons that flew in Korea. The 4th Fighter Wing, right?" Frank's eyes met his in the rearview mirror. "You've been busy." "The 4th Fighter Wing," Jake continued, "flew more combat missions than any other unit in the war. They shot down more MiGs than everyone else combined, but they also lost more pilots." "We did our job," Frank said simply. "Your job was to fly into MiG Alley every day, knowing that half the guys who went up might not come back down." Frank pulled over to the side of the road and turned around to face Jake. His eyes were different now, harder, but also somehow relieved, like a dam that had been holding back water for decades, was finally starting to crack. "You want to know about Korea, son? You want to know what it was really like?" Jake nodded. Frank took a deep breath. "March 15th, 1953. We were escorting B-29s to a target north of Pyongyang. 64 MiGs jumped us over the Yalu River. Biggest dogfight of the war." His voice was steady now, but Jake could hear the weight behind every word. "My wingman, Tommy Chun, took a hit early. His engine was on fire, but he stayed with the formation. Said he could make it back to base." Frank's hands were gripping the steering wheel again. "He couldn't. Went down about 30 miles behind enemy lines." Jake waited. Proto was to report him, Kia, and return to base. But Tommy was still alive down there, and I could hear him on the radio, so I went back. "You went back into enemy territory, alone?" Frank nodded. "Found him in a valley, surrounded by Chinese infantry. His leg was broken, couldn't walk. So I landed my Sabre in a rice paddy, pulled him into my lap, and flew us both out." Jake stared at him. "You flew an F-86 with 2 people in a single-seat cockpit? Wasn't easy. Tommy was bleeding all over my instruments. Chinese were shooting at us from the ground, and I had MiGs on my tail for 50 miles. But we made it." "What happened to Tommy?" Frank smiled. The first real smile Jake had ever seen from him. "He lived and became a doctor after the war. Saved a lot more lives than I ever did." They sat in silence for a while, watching traffic pass by. Finally, Jake asked, "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" Frank shrugged. "Who was gonna listen? And besides, what I did, it wasn't about being a hero. It was about bringing my friend home. That's what you do." Jake looked at this man, this quiet taxi driver who had spent 30 years invisible in plain sight, carrying stories that belonged in history books. "Frank, do you know how many pilots tried to rescue downed airmen in Korea?" Frank shook his head. "Hundreds." "Do you know how many succeeded in bringing someone back alive from behind enemy lines?" Frank was quiet. 12. In the entire war, 12 successful rescues out of hundreds of attempts. Frank's eyes widened slightly. "You're not just a veteran, Frank. You're a legend. There are probably books written about what you did." Frank laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "Son, legends don't drive taxis for 30 years. "Maybe they do," Jake said quietly. "Maybe that's exactly what legends do." The next morning, Jake didn't wait for Frank to pick him up. Instead, he took a military transport to the base and spent his lunch break in the base library, researching everything he could find about the Korean War, the 4th Fighter Wing, and pilot rescue operations. What he found changed everything. Captain Francisco Frank Martinez, call sign Sabre, had been credited with 7 confirmed kills and 3 probable kills during his tour in Korea. But more importantly, he had been recommended for the Medal of Honor for his rescue of Lieutenant Tommy Chen. The recommendation had been downgraded to a Silver Star due to procedural irregularities, military speak for the fact that Frank had disobeyed direct orders by going back for his wingman. Jake found newspaper clippings from 1953, grainy photos of Frank standing next to his F-86, interviews with other pilots who called him the best stick-and-rooter man in the squadron. There were official reports, mission logs, and even a letter from Tommy Chen's parents, thanking Frank for bringing their son home. But perhaps most importantly, Jake found a classified report that had been declassified in 1995. It detailed how Frank had actually flown 3 separate rescue missions during his tour, not just one. The Tommy Chen rescue was just the only one that had been officially documented. That evening, when Frank picked him up, Jake was quiet. He waited until they were halfway to his apartment before he spoke. "Frank, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Frank glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Go ahead. How many times did you go back?" Frank's hands tightened on the wheel. "What do you mean? How many times did you disobey orders to rescue someone?" The silence stretched between them for what felt like forever. Finally, Frank pulled over again, this time in front of a small park where children were playing on swings while their parents watched from benches. "3 times, Frank said quietly. Tommy was the third." Jake waited. "First time was a B-29 crew. 8 men went down near Chosin. I got 6 of them out over 2 trips. Lost 2 to the cold before I could get back to them." His voice was barely a whisper now. "Second time was a Navy pilot from the carrier. Kid was 19, same age as my little brother back home. Went down in a valley so narrow I had to hover my saber like a helicopter to get him out. Damn near ripped the wings off." Jake was staring at him now. "Frank, do you understand what you're telling me? You saved 11 men, 11 American servicemen who went home to their families because you couldn't leave them behind." Frank shook his head. "I also lost 2. That's what keeps me up at night. The other 99% of pilots would have followed orders and flown home. You saved 11 men, Frank. 11 fathers, sons, husbands, brothers." Frank looked at him in the mirror. "You think that makes me special? I think that makes you a hero." Frank laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Heroes don't end up driving taxis, son." "Maybe they do," Jake said. "Maybe heroes are the ones who just keep doing their job day after day without needing anyone to tell them they're special." Over the next few weeks, Jake began to see Frank differently. The way he drove with such precision, never flustered by traffic or aggressive drivers. The way he seemed to know every shortcut in the city, every back road and alternate route. The way he unconsciously scanned the sky whenever aircraft passed overhead. Frank Martinez hadn't just been a pilot. He had been a warrior, a guardian, a man who had risked everything to bring his brothers home. And now he was a taxi driver, still taking care of people, still getting them where they needed to go safely. One Thursday morning, Jake made a decision that would change everything. "Frank, I want you to meet someone." Frank glanced at him. "I'm not much for meeting people, son. This one's different. He's been looking for you for 70 years. Frank's hands went still on the wheel. "What are you talking about?" Jake pulled out his phone and showed Frank a photograph. It was an elderly Asian man in a doctor's coat standing in front of a hospital. "His name is Dr. Thomas Chen. He's been trying to find the pilot who saved him in Korea." Frank stared at the photo, his eyes wide. "Tommy, he's 89 years old now, still practicing medicine in San Francisco, still telling people about the crazy pilot who landed in a rice paddy and flew him home in his lap." Frank's eyes were wet now. I thought he might be dead. He's not, and he's been looking for you." Jake had spent hours on the phone with Dr. Chen, explaining how he'd found Frank, how the hero everyone had been searching for had been driving a taxi in anonymity for 3 decades. "Frank, he wants to see you. He wants to thank you." Frank pulled over, his hands shaking. "I don't know if I can. You saved his life. You gave him 70 years. He wouldn't have had. He became a doctor, Frank. He saved thousands of lives. He had children, grandchildren, all because you couldn't leave him behind." Frank was crying now, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I was just doing my job. Your job was to fly escort missions and return to base. You chose to do more than your job. You chose to be a hero." 2 weeks later, Jake arranged for Frank to meet Dr. Chen at the base. When the elderly doctor saw Frank walking across the tarmac, he broke into a run despite his age. The 2 men embraced like the brothers they had become in that cockpit over Korea, both of them crying, both of them finally able to let go of the weight they had carried for 70 years. "You saved me," Dr. Chen whispered. "You saved yourself," Frank replied. "I just gave you a ride home." The reunion was captured by the base photographer, and the story spread quickly through military channels. Soon, reporters were calling, wanting to interview the taxi driver hero. Frank initially refused all requests, but Jake convinced him to tell his story just once. The interview was published in Air Force Times, then picked up by national news outlets. The headline read, "The cab driver who was a Korean War hero." But what resonated most with readers wasn't the dramatic rescue stories or the medals Frank had earned. It was the simple truth that heroes walk among us every day, invisible and unrecognized, doing their jobs with quiet dignity. Letters poured in from around the country. Other veterans who had served in Korea, families of men who had been saved by anonymous pilots, young servicemen who said Frank's story inspired them to serve with honor. But the letter that meant the most to Frank came from Tommy Chun's daughter. "Mr. Martinez," she wrote, "you gave my father 70 years of life. He used those years to save countless others. He delivered over 3,000 babies, performed emergency surgery on hundreds of trauma victims, and trained dozens of young doctors. All of that happened because you couldn't leave him behind. Thank you for giving the world my father's healing hands. Frank kept that letter in his wallet, next to the faded photo of his squadron. The publicity changed Frank's life, but not in the way most people expected. He didn't write a book or go on speaking tours. He didn't retire from driving or move to a mansion. He kept driving his taxi, kept picking up passengers, kept being the quiet, dependable man he had always been. But now, sometimes, passengers recognized him. Young military personnel would climb into his cab and quietly thank him for his service. Elderly veterans would share their own stories, grateful to finally have someone who understood. Children would ask their parents why the taxi driver was famous, and parents would explain that heroes come in all forms. Frank's favorite passenger remained Jake, who continued to ride with him twice a week even after the story broke. Their conversations had evolved from polite small talk to deep discussions about service, sacrifice, and what it means to be a hero. "You know what I learned from all this?" Frank said one morning as they drove past the airport. "What's that?" "Being a hero isn't about the medals or the recognition. It's about doing the right thing when no one's watching. It's about showing up every day and doing your job, whatever that job might be." Jake nodded. "Is that why you kept driving?" Frank smiled. "Someone's got to get people where they need to go. Might as well be me." As they passed the military section of the airport, Frank's eyes automatically scanned the jets, just as they had every day for 30 years. But now, instead of painful memories, he saw something else: continuity. The young pilots training on those aircraft were the same age he had been in Korea. They had the same dreams, the same fears, the same determination to serve something greater than themselves. "You see those kids out there?" Frank asked, nodding toward the flight line where young pilots were conducting pre-flight checks. "Yeah, they're the real heroes. They're the ones who are going to keep us safe, who are going to make the hard choices when the time comes. I just hope they know that being a hero isn't about being perfect. It's about caring enough to try." Jake looked at Frank, this man who had spent 70 years being humble about acts of extraordinary courage. "What would you tell them if you could?" Frank thought for a moment. "I'd tell them to remember that every person they meet is somebody's son or daughter. Every life matters. And sometimes, the most heroic thing you can do is just show up and do your job, whatever that job might be." As they pulled up to the base gate, Sergeant Miller waved them through with his usual salute. But today, Frank rolled down his window and called out to him, "Sergeant, you keep up the good work. What you're doing here matters." Miller beamed. "Thank you, sir. It's an honor to serve." Frank drove on, and Jake realized he had just witnessed something profound. Here was a man who had performed acts of incredible heroism, who had risked everything to save others, who had carried the weight of war for 70 years. And his greatest concern was making sure a young gate guard knew his work mattered. That evening, as Frank dropped Jake off at his apartment, the young pilot had one final question. "Frank, do you ever regret it? Any of it? The missions, the risks, the years of silence?" Frank considered the question carefully. "I regret the 2 men I couldn't save. I regret that it took 70 years to see Tommy again. But do I regret going back for them? Do I regret trying to bring them home?" He looked at Jake in the rearview mirror, his eyes clear and certain. "Never. Not for a single second. Because that's what we do. We don't leave people behind. We don't give up on each other. And we keep showing up, day after day, whether anyone notices or not." Jake climbed out of the cab, but before closing the door, he leaned down to the window. "Frank, for what it's worth, I think you're exactly the kind of hero the world needs. The kind who doesn't need a cape or a parade. The kind who just does the right thing and then goes back to work." Frank smiled, tipped his cap, and drove away. Into the evening traffic, just another taxi in a city full of them. But Jake knew the truth, and now, so did the world. Sometimes the most extraordinary heroes are the ones who choose to remain ordinary, who find honor in simple service, and who understand that true heroism isn't about being recognized, it's about being reliable. The next morning, Frank would pick up Jake at 0630 hours, just like always. They would drive past the airport, past the jets, past the memories of a war most people had forgotten, and Frank would do what he had done for 30 years, get his passenger where he needed to go, safely and on time, because that's what heroes do. They show up, they do their job, and they never, ever leave anyone behind. Frank Martinez, taxi driver, Korean War veteran, quiet hero, understood a truth that many people never learn. The most powerful stories aren't always the ones that get told. Sometimes they're the ones that get lived, day after day, mile after mile, one fare at a time. And sometimes, if you're lucky enough to be paying attention, you might find yourself riding with a legend who's been hiding in plain sight all along. The next time you climb into a taxi, or meet a quiet stranger, or pass by someone whose story you don't know, remember Frank Martinez. Remember that heroes don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they just turn on the meter and ask where to. And if you're wise enough to listen, you might just discover that you're in the presence of someone who once flew through enemy fire to bring a friend home, and who has spent every day since then doing the same thing in different ways, making sure people reach their destinations safely, because that's what heroes do. They serve, they sacrifice, and they never stop caring about it. Getting people home. Have you ever met someone like Frank? Someone who served quietly, who carried incredible stories without ever bragging about them? Share their name in the comments below. Tell us about the unsung heroes in your life. Because here at the Human Stories, we believe that every person has a story worth telling, and the most powerful stories are often the ones that wait quietly to be discovered. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel and help us honor the Frank Martinezes of the world, the quiet heroes who surround us every day, asking nothing more than the chance to serve. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, the next time you meet someone whose story you don't know, take a moment to listen. You might just discover that you're in the presence of greatness.